Team G3 welcomes the Board of Director and Chief Executive Officer to the presentation on the latest event in which Apple suppliers are linked to forced labor. We will begin with values.
Team G3 took a close look at our core values in light of the recent ethical and societal issues that have been brought up. We place supplier responsibility at the top point of our values. Let's take a look at how we aligned. Initially, we looked at Apple's stated values and compared them with what we had as defined executive values. We realigned in light of the most recent events and put supplier responsibility, integrity, and accountability at our top three aligned values. Let's take a look at the triggering event, which was a recent report that leaked out to media outlets identifying Apple suppliers that were accused of using forced labor in their factories. In this event, thousands of Muslim Uyghur workers were sent to Apple suppliers. At least 5 suppliers have been linked to forced labor. Initially, we know that Apple has denied and continues to reiterate their zero tolerance to these sort of events. Let's take a look at who raised these concerns.
It was the Tech Transparency Project, the nonpartisan watchdog offshoot of Campaign for Accountability, that raised the initial concerns in accusing one of Apple's most prominent iPhone component suppliers, Lens Technology, of using forced labor in its factories. TTP shared their findings with the Washington Post, and WAPO is widely credited for breaking the story. Moving on to thinking about the root cause, how did the world's most valuable company find itself facing disgrace? Setting aside cultural and systemic factors and looking introspectively, Apple's dominant concentration on profits and revenue was the overarching root cause. Prioritizing shareholders over stakeholders and profit-focused tunnel vision then set the table for Apple's collision with basic human rights and social justice societal issues, wherein Apple also ran a array of ethical pitfalls such as motivated blindness and letting someone else do the dirty work. The next slides will evaluate the actions available to Apple.
Prior to the TTP article, Apple had previously been found to be using suppliers in China which used forced labor. CEO Tim Cook and Apple had published statements and guidance which strongly supported reforms and a thorough vetting process to ensure it wouldn't happen again. TTP findings contradicted these statements from Apple. It later came out that Apple was allegedly paying a large sum of money to a lobbying firm to stop US government from passing a law against Uyghur-based suppliers in China. They had also asked the SEC to block stock shareholders from requesting transparency. On the next slide, we looked at the outcome of this response. As you can see from this grid, the red is negative and the green is positive. The half-hearted response from Apple proved to be a failure in almost every way. Economically, the decision to turn a blind eye to forced labor was a positive. Costs stayed low, profits were high. But in every other way, their approach and actions to this issue showed that Apple had a motivated blindness to the issue and did not really want anything to change. There remained a risk of the scandal repeating again in the future. Next slide.
Below is the recommendation that we considered and rejected. The recommendation was to enforce the zero tolerance policy espoused by Apple and sever the business relationship with the affected suppliers. However, doing so would lead to significant disruptions in our supply chain and would lead to increased costs and lost sales. As the next slide will show, the significant impact it will have on our shareholders and stakeholders. So our analysis shows that long-term, it's going to be generally negative for all our stakeholders, and therefore, this is why we have an alternate recommendation in the next slide. So our chosen recommendation is to collaborate with our stakeholders to have a stakeholder-centric approach to eliminating modern-day slavery from our supply chain. And to do so, we will commit to our already espoused values that we have outlined before, as well as partner with like-minded organizations and industry watchdogs, as well as realign incentives to find and eliminate these blind spots in our supply chain. So the next slide will show our analysis shows that in long term, this would be mostly beneficial for all our stakeholders. And therefore, this is our recommendation. And the next slide will go over this in more detail.
So why is this the best possible course of action? So as we've outlined the event, what Apple originally did, our rejected recommendation, and now where we are with directly connecting executive team values to suppliers, it will allow for a stakeholder focus, which means new incentives that factors in all constituents, supplier responsibility, where we're ensuring products are manufactured in safe environments where human rights aren't infringed upon, integrity, eliminating potential use of forced labor by contractors, accountability, enhancing our oversight through these new strategic partnerships with global human rights and watchdog groups. Lastly, we've taken in consideration unintended consequences and how we will mitigate them. To prevent watchdog groups from receiving funding directly from Apple, we will establish a tech industry coalition to create bylaws and charters to prevent direct funding. Additionally, increased costs of supply chain disruptions are very important to prevent. We will identify and diversify our suppliers to minimize increased costs and production constraints. Lastly, competitive disadvantages could affect Apple by being the only company enforcing such policies. So again, through that collaboration with the tech industry, we will standardize the use of non-forced labor by suppliers. We thank the board and chief executive officer for listening through our analysis, findings, recommendations. We look forward to partnering on the implementation. We thank you. BG3 welcomes the media to today's press briefing to address the recent event with Apple suppliers being linked to forced labor. So the issue at hand, the watchdog group Tech Transparency Project conducted an investigation which uncovered Apple suppliers in China potentially using forced labor, specifically with the Uyghur population. Apple does acknowledge that small number of suppliers in China in the past have employed forced laborers. Apple remains committed to holding suppliers accountable, and we will evolve and improve our industry-leading efforts to combat modern-day slavery in our business and supply chain programs. We take this concern very seriously in addressing some of the blind spots that the watchdog group identified. We are very concerned about any human right violations connected to the production of our products, from cell phones to tablets, etc. We're also concerned about any reputational damage to our brand with our stakeholders, including employees, consumers, and shareholders. Lastly, we're also concerned about any diminished trust from our remaining supply chain partners, which could potentially decrease the ease of doing business with Apple. What should have happened? Apple prided itself as having the strongest supplier code of conduct in the industry. It had existing controls in place to prevent the utilization of forced labor. Our policies should have detected and identified any such violation. We acknowledge that this matter had surfaced blind spots in the original methodology employed by Apple. We will regroup on our strategy and reframe its method of attack to combat such humanitarian concerns from a more holistic approach. So we are 100% committed to addressing the root cause, and we have laid out a timeline to address these issues with our suppliers. Beginning in 2022, we're doubling down on executing and improving our existing strategies, as well as partnering with those oversight organizations we mentioned, and developing incentives and reporting violations in 2023 with our tech industry coalition. And lastly, we're going to be diversifying our supply chain. This reinforces the importance of identifying and eliminating ethical dilemmas to ensure corporate change. In closing, we have three key themes. Apple acknowledges our oversight miss, and we remain committed to monitoring and holding suppliers accountable. Secondly, we will implement these new initiatives through our collaborations with global human rights and watchdog groups. Lastly, Apple is 100% fully committed to all of our global stakeholders, including the prevention of labor and human rights violations. We want to thank the media for attending today's press briefing. We look forward to continuing to provide updates in the near future. We thank you.